sometimes I get frustrated with myself that I feel like, come on, you should have accepted this by now. This is your reality. Actually, what I've learned is that grief is ongoing, and it will always be a part of my life.
Hannah, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah,
How are
I'm
you
not
doing?
too bad. I've had a really manic morning, so I feel like this will be a little bit of chill before the rest of my day, which I've just had a glance at, and it's like back-to-back meetings, which I shouldn't have done to myself, but I have, and here we are.
Yeah, I feel like it should be closer to Friday than it is.
Oh, same. I woke up yesterday and I thought the entire day was Thursday, and it wasn't. It was Tuesday, and it was a nightmare.
That is gutting.
So, the first question that I ask absolutely every single person who comes on this podcast is, how do you refer to your disability?
I guess I refer to my disability as quote unquote like complex chronic illness or acquired disability. I got sick. It's going to be seven. I got sick basically on my 21st birthday, so it's going to be 7 years next in like 2 weeks. But I have been in pain my whole life. I just didn't have a name for it.
Wow. And there's something to be said about acquiring a disability, like at any point in time, but particularly when it's like late teens, early 20s, because they're such formative parts of your life. What was the experience for you like acquiring a disability at that age?
I think it was quite, like you say, formative. I look back now and think this sliding doors moment, like what life could have been, who I could have become, and I'm actually going through, I feel like a bit of a existential crisis at the moment about separating me from my illness and who is the quote
Yeah.
unquote real me, and how do I find myself again after feeling like so much of myself has been tied to illness. So I think when I first got sick, I was in denial, honestly, for the first couple of years. So I have one of the conditions I have is ME, which is a post-viral illness. So I got sick on an airplane on a flight to Las Vegas for my 21st birthday. I didn't get treated properly for the virus, and then from there I developed ME. And ME is a hugely stigmatized condition. It's been for the longest time, particularly in the last 50 years, been considered psychosomatic, so it's all in your head.
Yeah.
And that comes with a lot of stigma of invisibility. And to be honest, most people in my life didn't believe I was sick when I first got sick, which means that you just feel so deeply alone. And I had doctors telling me I was depressed, or if I just worked a little harder, I would feel better, or have I tried running, and like all of that bullshit.
Yeah.
So it's only in the last 2 or 3 years, I would say, have I really been able to confidently say, actually, that time of my life was really quite terrible, because when you're going through it, you almost can't admit to yourself how bad it is.
Yeah. And there's a lot to be said about sometimes you just have to go through something to get through it, and that very much sounds like that experience is that actually at the point in time you couldn't really look to the left or the right, you kind of just had to go through it to get through it. And you're right. I think also with ME, I think you associate it as well with like a lot older people. You don't really necessarily associate ME with younger people. And because of that, do you feel like you were judged is maybe not the right word, but listened to is maybe a better way of talking about it. Like, do you feel like you were listened to when you were describing like your symptoms to doctors and things like that?
No, definitely I didn't feel listened to. And I think that's quite a universal experience of people with the disease. I was the only reason I knew about Emmy is because a childhood friend, got sick 6 months before me when she was at university. She got a kidney infection, which turned into her post-viral illness. So the only reason why I had the language to describe my symptoms was because of her.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't think I would have known. And the same goes, I also have endometriosis, which is another condition that's often stigmatized and considered, especially by male doctors, as an overreaction to pain.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I only, again, in the last couple of years, have I been able to find my voice in medical institutions and advocate to myself. And most of that is through the knowledge I've gained on social media.
Yeah. And there is so much to be said in like the brilliance of social media. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's brilliant and it's also the devil all at once, and you kind of have to learn how to tame the beast to protect yourself. But like you said, without that knowledge online and without other people almost helping you with the language, you wouldn't have been able to, well, you would have been able to at some point, but maybe it would have taken you a bit longer to almost push forward with what you knew about yourself and about your disability, and how you talk about it and the language that you use, and all of those kinds of things. And actually I think it's one of those moments, isn't it, where you kind of got to stop for a second, and you're right, like 21, super formative age, and trying to separate yourself from like chronic illness or disability can be really, really difficult, especially when you acquire it at that age. And actually that journey in itself can't have been easy. And I would love it if you were able to delve a bit more into that, if it's not too pressing.
No, yeah, I think it was so prior to getting sick, I traveled the world from 18 to 21. I backpacked through like 30 different countries. That's what I came back to the UK to get a bit of money together, and then I would go off. Like that was
Yeah.
how I started my young adult life, was like these huge, great big adventures. And I would always say to people, I'm allergic to staying in the same place for too long. I was just obsessed with staying on, like, just almost like outrunning myself. And I always had struggled with my mental health as a teenager, so I was always feeling like I was looking for the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And coming from that level of excitement and adrenaline and thrill and adventure to completely bedbound with no understanding of what you're going through, with all of your friends pretty much unable to even like remotely understand what it's like to lose mobility, to
Mm-hmm.
be so tired that you can't really, open your eyes for very long in a day. That, to a 21-year-old, and I think about myself before I got sick, like, I didn't know about disability. I didn't really
Mm-hmm.
understand. I didn't have I didn't have many frames of reference for it. So I forgive a lot of my friends for that experience, but it was extremely isolating because I closed myself off to my friends, and then they sort of mostly just walked away.
Yeah. I love what you said about how previously, before becoming unwell, you didn't really have a frame of reference for disability. And like, as you said, that's nobody's fault. It's just how life is. But actually, it goes to show that there is such an inequality in knowledge and education when it comes to disability, because unless disability touches you or like a loved one, or it's like, like a second person removed, you don't really understand the experience of disability until you kind of go through it. And that in itself must have been a journey too, because you're kind of learning new language, learning how to handle yourself, like you said, in like medical situations, but also being able to explain what's going on for you to other people around you, like you said, like your friends and like family as well. That in itself must have been a really interesting experience, to be able to almost advocate for yourself, but in a way that you haven't had to before.
Definitely, and I think, and it's really funny reflecting back on that now, because I feel like I'm now that person because I'm still relatively young
Mm-hmm.
compared to like most people in my life. Their only experience disability is like with grandparents, with other older
Yeah.
people. But now I'm that point of reference for people. Like they like, it's really funny being out because I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user now, so I use a
Mm-hmm.
wheelchair pretty much always when I leave the house, and being out with friends and then being like so offended and flabbergasted when we don't have drop curbs, or when
Yeah.
there's I live in Amsterdam, so there's bikes everywhere all over the pavement, you can't move for shit. And they sort of, they're shocked on my behalf and they're offended, and they're like, we have to do something about this, because they've never sat in a wheelchair before
Yeah.
and they've never been like that. So it's sort of like passing on the baton of like, now I'm that person for them and someone else was that person for me.
Yeah. And actually, I love the fact that you just casually dropped in there, like, oh, I live in Amsterdam. Like, we all want to live in a different place, don't we? Like, let's be honest, like, England is not the one. But I was wondering, because of that, what's the medical experience like in Amsterdam compared to over here? And now I've actually got a whole load of questions that I'm dying to ask you about Amsterdam.
Yeah, so I moved here for my partner's job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would have moved abroad as a young disabled single woman. Like I completely um, sort of realized the privileged position I'm in that sense because I was like came with my partner and
Mm-hmm.
he came with work. We had a stable job, etc. Um, the medical, so it operates under private healthcare here, so everyone in the country pays, and if you can't afford to pay, you're given it for free or subsidized. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot different, obviously, from the NHS. And my endometriosis really peaked in about the January of 2021. I actually collapsed during the pandemic in my house, and it was really, a really traumatic experience. And from that period on, I was in and out of A&E for a lot of the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure if you had the unfortunate situation of being in A&E during the pandemic in a big city, but it was really traumatizing. I was diagnosed with medically
Yeah.
induced PTSD from that. I saw things I never wanted to ever see, and that I still have nightmares
Mm-hmm.
about. So going from that was like my most recent set of experiences with the British healthcare system. So I feel like I was starting like the bar was extremely low,
Yeah.
and I was going from there into the Dutch system, which is very different. Obviously, it's paid for, which means that there's more resources available, but there's also a language barrier and there's a cultural barrier. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think the Dutch, and my Dutch friends wouldn't mind me saying, aren't known for their bedside manner, perhaps. They're quite straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
It feels sometimes that they lack empathy for your medical situations, but I would say that, and I've unfortunately had to go to their version of A&E or been in emergency situations since I've moved here, and I do feel like the process is a lot less stressful. It's a lot
Mm-hmm.
less triggering for me. But what I say to everyone who asks about it is that there is no perfect healthcare system for a chronically ill or disabled person.
Yeah.
Like I'm yet to meet someone who says my country, yeah, they're killing it. We're smashing healthcare for people with incurable disease. Like
Yeah.
that's not really happening anywhere. So you still encounter ableist doctors, you still encounter bureaucracy with paperwork, you still encounter doctors with misinformation. Like that all still goes on.
Mm-hmm.
But the experience of like being in the system here, yeah, I find less traumatizing, I guess.
Yeah. And you were talking about endometriosis then, and obviously, like I think it's a very well-known fact that endometriosis is really difficult to diagnose, and like I think it's on average it takes between like 8 to 12 years to diagnose. And I was wondering if it's not too traumatic to revisit that time. How how did your diagnosis and like going for that diagnosis, how did that all come about? Was that because you passed out, or was it because you always knew that there was something there, but you didn't know how to press forward with it?
Yeah, so I've had painful periods since I was, like 12 years old, which is a common experience for a lot of people. And I was diagnosed when I was 24. Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
that's, 12 years, which pretty much meet the top end of that diagnosis waiting process. But I wouldn't say I started pursuing proper healthcare for my debilitating period symptoms until I was about 18, 19. I was put on various birth controls, which,
Yeah.
like I said, I've always struggled with my mental health, and those seriously impacted my mental health. So I sort of just muddled through, and then I started bleeding after sex
Mm-hmm.
in about 2020, quite randomly, after deciding to come off all of my birth control again to see again if it would lift this ever chronic depression. And when I went to my GP with that, that was the first time I actually felt listened to, which I think speaks to medical misogyny
Yeah.
and the power of, the system that thinks it's important that men receive their pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when my GP noticed some irregular, like fibroid type things in my
Mm-hmm.
in an examination and put me on to be diagnosed by a specialist. And then because we were in a pandemic and they had noticed a cyst, I think they said it was the size of a golf ball, like really basically quite a large cyst that
Wow.
um, they don't know how long it was there for, which was obviously posing quite a threat because if an endometrioma type cyst bursts, you can all kinds of things can go wrong
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes very dangerous. So that's when I sought private surgery actually for my endometriosis, because the waiting list where I was living in Brighton was upwards of 2 years. And I
Yeah.
really had this deep, ever anxious feeling of like, once they told me that that was inside me, I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't stop thinking about this foreign object like growing, and it just really messed with my head in a way that I hadn't really considered, even though I've been living with ME for a few years. Like, just this idea of this thing growing that could at any moment really mess up my life.
Mm-hmm.
I was so afraid. Um, so that's when I ended up seeking private treatment. And through that private treatment, I was then diagnosed with another condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic condition
Mm-hmm.
that I've had since birth, that now it turns out my mum found out that she had it, even though she's in her 60s. She found out because I was diagnosed. So now I have this trifecta of illnesses that really aren't friends with each other and make
Yeah.
make it all quite difficult.
Yeah, I've spoken and I know a lot of people with EDS, and it's not easy. And what I kind of find interesting about the way that you were diagnosed is that it was through something else. Because a lot of people say that with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos, I can never get it right. EDS, I'm going to stick to that. So I apologize to the people who get offended. I'm not meaning to be rude. I just can't sometimes get my words out. But a lot of people say, and like you said, symptoms of EDS quite often go with other things. And so what they say is that when you hear hoofs, you automatically think of a horse, but actually you're a zebra. And I find
Mm-hmm.
that super interesting that actually, like you weren't even going for a diagnosis of this, but actually like this also reared its head, and like here you are with the trifecta, like you've got one of everything, and that is what it is for you, and that's how it works. And it can't be easy to have thinking your whole life that you are quote unquote like non-disabled, like quote unquote normal, and then all of a sudden to have life completely change and have things rear their head. And actually it's like with EDS, it's been your whole entire life, and actually when you think about it, it can make a bit more sense. But with all of that in mind, how has your disability or your disabilities, how have they impacted your career and the career choices that you've made around your disabilities? Has it been something that you've taken into account, or has it been something that actually you don't think about in the workspace?
No, I think about it every day.
Yeah.
So when I left my first like grown-up job when I was 21
Mm-hmm.
because of the ME diagnosis. I physically was unable to work, and that was for quite a long time. And then I was raised in a family of like, you like, success is very important,
Mm-hmm.
careers are very important. My mum's like self-made, she's very successful at what she does, she built a business from the ground up. And so both me and my brother were raised in this like, this, not expectation, but this sort of just like, that's what we were always striving for. Like, that's what
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was going to be. Was I was like quite smart at school. I thought I would be a lawyer, or then I sort of found creativity in my teens. So I was like, right, I'll be a fashion designer. I'll be this, I'll be that. Like, I always was shooting for the stars. And
Yeah.
then like I say, my mental health was really impacted in my teen years. So I ended up not really um, sort of following through, I guess, on some of those promises, and I left to go traveling. And then I became unwell. And then about a year into having ME, I was like, I can't just keep sitting at home. Like, this is making me more unhappy.
Yeah.
So I started nannying, and that just brought me so much joy. Like, I've always loved children so much.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I look back and think about how I was completely in denial of my particularly chronic fatigue, which is like the hallmark symptom of ME.
Mm-hmm.
um I was like taking naps in my car waiting to pick up the kids from nursery and school. Like, I was drinking several cups of coffee and a Red Bull a day just to keep going. Like, I really
Yeah.
was betraying my body in a lot of ways. But through that experience, I realized I love kids, and I was like, oh, do you know what, maybe I'll go to university and I'll train to be a teacher, because
Mm-hmm.
that's a stable, solid career. I just wanted something where it was I didn't have to think about the next move. And I was like, if I take away all of the mental impact, I'll just be a teacher. I love kids. It just made sense to me in my brain in my early 20s. So I went to university to do that, and then the pandemic hit, and then I collapsed, and then my health took this whole other turn that became a lot more serious. And I quickly realized, while teaching in a school during the pandemic, like, this isn't going to fly. Like, I can't keep myself upright for 7-8 hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
plus on top of the endo symptoms. My EDS, like, mobility issues, started to really rear their heads. And then I found myself writing about illness, and I started by writing about the pandemic and how hurt and betrayed the ME community felt because of it being a post-viral illness and COVID being a illness that we obviously now know causes long COVID. So we started writing articles for newspapers about that,
Yeah.
and really sort of just quite quickly found myself as a journalist. And it really happened out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't what I was planning to do. I'd always loved writing, but it was that kind of job, like, because I was raised in that success oriented household, I didn't think it was like writing was something else other people did. It wasn't something we would do in our house as a job. Like, it wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
even though my mum always brought us up to love books and stuff, it just wasn't something that I ever thought was feasible. um so yeah, I found myself writing, getting quite a lot of notice for being a journalist, but those tendencies from that success driven household really brought me to be wanting to be the best, wanting to high achieve. How many articles can I write? How many bylines can I get? Like, what's the biggest and the best I can climb to?
Mm-hmm.
And that went on, I would say, until pretty recently, to be honest.
Yeah.
I took another step back, because I just couldn't handle, even though I was self-employed, I just couldn't handle the deadlines and the constant having to put yourself out there. I realized the thing that hurts me the most when I'm in an energy crash or flaring my symptoms is external deadlines and feeling that pressure to perform for other people.
Yeah.
So then that makes it really hard to be a journalist because you're always on short deadlines
Yeah.
and you're always uh, fighting for the next piece of work. So last summer, I started working for an endometriosis startup. It's called Friendo. We're like a support app and workplace employee benefits program they've been helping to develop. And that's the first job I've had since becoming ill where I felt like I can see longevity in this. Like, just it's just me and my boss, and we have other few freelancers, but having someone who just gets it, like, who you can be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be late to that meeting, so I'm actually stuck on the toilet, and she's like, lol, it's okay. Like, like, we just have this mutual understanding of what it's like.
Yeah. And
um
that's beneficial for you and beneficial for like for your employer. But I really love what you said about you essentially you fell into your job, because I always think that that's the best way to be when it comes to employment, and that's an incredibly privileged thing to say, and I'm not disputing that at all. But to be able to kind of stumble into something and find out that you really love it, and then almost taking a step back from that to be like, do you know what, as much as I love this and as much as like I found my feet here, this isn't good for me. And being able to say that, I think is such a hallmark of strength, because it takes a lot to walk away from something that you love and that you love doing. And like you said, you know, you're always striving for the best, and sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away, which is actually a quite difficult thing to say.
yeah, 100%. And I also feel like I loved teaching so much.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it with all my heart, and if I wasn't as unwell as I was, like, I would walk back to that job tomorrow. And I still grieve the fact that I never got to see out that career,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just, and one of my best friends is a teacher, so talking to her about it and her life and her job, and just it's just unexplainable what joy it can bring you to be surrounded by these little humans all day long who just have so much hope, and they lack so many of the fears and the worries that we carry. And it honestly is just, there's no feeling like it. And I think I still feel a lot of anger and resentment that even though it's a very unglamorous job, and if you tell people like I was a teacher or I'm a journalist, like, people have preconceptions about
Mm-hmm.
which of those jobs pays better and what has more social capital. But honestly, like, if I wasn't as unwell, then I would still be doing that,
Yeah.
because I've never had a job that brought me as much happiness.
Yeah. I like to think that if we ever go through hard times, or when we do go through hard times, and you kind of touched on it earlier, that you kind of just have to go through it. But if we can look back on those times and notice something positive within ourselves, because and the reason I ask this question is because I feel like as disabled people, we very rarely look at the positive things that we ourselves hold. So like we very rarely look at the positive traits that we have, because we are consistently fighting with some form of ableism or internalized ableism, and it can be really difficult to look on the positive side of stuff. But through any hardship that you've experienced, has there been a particular positive trait that you've really honed that you're actually, on reflection, really proud of?
I guess it part of me wants to say resilience, but I think I'm still, like I say, even 7.5 years into being really poorly, I still resent the fact that I had to become so strong,
Yeah.
because it feels like quite unfair, I guess, and it feels quite like I don't like the idea that I'm a better person because I became sick. Like
Mm-hmm.
I know I could have grown and changed, and my 20s would have looked different, but I also would have, hopefully, I do believe I would have still ended up as a, as a decently well-rounded human
Yeah.
without going through this. But I don't think it's resilience, but it's more so, it's flexibility, I guess. It is that ability to adapt to all these different jobs. And sometimes I look at my CV and think, like, oh, for God's sake, you can't just stick with one thing. Like, why can't you just be, why
Mm-hmm.
couldn't you have just, picked a career and done it? And now you look flaky, or you look flighty, or you can't ever keep a job for very long. But actually, I think I was chatting to my boss the other day, and she was like, how do you know how to do that? And I was like, oh, I actually once had this office job where I had to do X, Y, and Z. And I have actually built up a really big range of skills because I
Yeah.
was sort of doing all those different things. And the same with teaching, like teaching and being with kids teaches you so much. And university teaches you so much. Like all of these different experiences was that, like, yeah, I don't have a linear career path, but I have learned a lot. And I think that makes me knowledgeable in a lot of ways, I guess.
Yeah. I love what you said about not having a linear career path, because I look back at my career path and it is literally up and down, in and out. I've had a very similar career path to you, where I at one point thought I was going to be a special ed teacher, and then I didn't do that. And then I thought I was going to like run a holistic well-being brand, and then I didn't do that. So like there are so many things that you've spoken about where I'm like, oh, like I can totally see that, like I totally understand that. And I think it's really valuable for people to realize, like, you can do loads of different things and it doesn't make you any less of a person. And somehow society's like drilled into us that you stick to one thing from your 20s until you're in your 50s or later. And actually, when I look at who I was at 21 and I look at who I am now, I'm a completely different person. Like, the things that I believe are different, and the way that I live my life is very different. And how can we expect our jobs to stay the same if we change so much? Because our thoughts change, our views change, everything changes. And I find it way more interesting when someone hops around a bit and they're like, I tried this, it didn't necessarily work out, but I learned this from that job, and I did this, and actually I learned from that I love doing this, or actually, like, I hate this part of society and this doesn't work for me, but actually it's given me this and I can challenge this. I think to have that experience is way more valuable than to be like, do you know what, I decided I was going to be a lawyer at 17 and I've stuck with it for the past however many years, and that's what I do. There's a lot to be said.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like maddening that we ask people at 14 to pick their GCSEs that choose their A levels, which then choose what they
Yeah.
do at university, which then dictate what they do as a job. Like, that is so many steps, and so many things are so changeable at that very early age that, yeah, it's kind of absurd.
Yeah. I know that we've spoken about this and we've touched on it a couple of times already, but you spoke about grieving and like grieving your early 20s had you not become ill and had you not had all your various different diagnoses come up. And I was wondering, for anybody who's going through something similar, have you got a piece of advice for them and the grieving process?
I think what I've learned, sometimes I get frustrated with myself that I feel like, come on, you should have accepted this by now. This is your
Mm-hmm.
reality. Why do you still have days where you're wishing to be a teacher? Why do you still get frustrated when you can't get on the tram properly in your wheelchair? Like, I feel like I should be done with that by now. But I think actually what I've learned is that grief grief is ongoing,
Mm-hmm.
and it will always be a part of my life. I think particularly with EDS and, well, with all of my conditions, there are elements of the fact that a lot of them are progressive.
Yeah.
Like there will be declines, and I have experienced a big decline in the last 2 years, and having to re-establish my baseline and renegotiate my ability to do things, that feels like you're grieving all over again. And just as you get used to something, something else is thrown up in the air, and that's part of life. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is what I wish I had learned that a bit earlier. Instead of saying like, oh, I wish I accepted my grief earlier, I think I wish I understood that grief is ongoing, it's changeable, and it's never ending. And that's actually to learn to live with it instead of this putting a full stop next to it, I think is what's more beneficial.
I love that grief is actually like, it's ever changing, and it's something that you learn to live with and be okay with rather than against. Because I like said it again, there's a lot to be said for living with something rather than fighting it, because when we fight something, that's usually when problems arise, and actually we can become, you know, and this is really not a technical term, but we become like somewhat more disabled, or we become more ill, or we become, things flare up for us. And it's not acceptance, but it's learning to live alongside something that's uncomfortable, but kind of knowing that it will always be there. There is kind of a comfort in that, in a really obscure way, because it will be a consistent, if that makes sense. And we look for consistency in life. So if you can kind of accept that the grieving part is always going to be there, it might not be as big, it might just be like a little pang every now and then, but it will be there. And being able to be like, okay, that's fine, like I'm allowed to have that feeling, is really quite important.
Definitely. I think it's that I really struggle with the acceptance element of my illnesses, but
Mm-hmm.
I think, and the yeah, that unfair feeling of why me, why
Mm-hmm.
now, why this, every time you have to cancel a plan, or you can't go somewhere because it's not accessible, or you have to disappoint people, like that same feeling of unable to accept your circumstance bubbles up. But I think looking at it and saying like, yeah, I see you, I feel those feelings today, instead of just sort of making yourself feel worse twice by,
Yeah.
canceling the plan makes you feel bad, and then making yourself feel bad for canceling the plan is just like hurting yourself twice.
Yeah. And that is so true. There's no point in hurting yourself twice. Like, the initial pain is going to stick anyway, so I don't need to inflict it more on myself.
Exactly. And I think it's so hard to be kind to yourself, and it's even harder, I find, to be kind to myself in situations where, for example, a medical professional is unkind to me, or I feel
Mm.
judged, or I feel people staring, or whatever it is that's happening. Those are the moments I actually find it harder to be kind to myself. But those are the times that you need it the most.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I want to pop back to Amsterdam for a minute. And I was wondering,
Yeah.
is there like a difference between how disability is seen in the Netherlands? What is it? The Netherlands? It is the Netherlands, isn't it? Is it?
Hmm.
Yeah, it is. Is
Yeah.
is there a difference between how disability is seen in the Netherlands compared to how disability is seen in the UK? Like, have you noticed a difference between the two?
Culturally, I would say I think they're a bit further behind. There's actually a really, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to misspeak if any Dutch friends or people are watching, but there is a real deep history of homeopathy here. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
alternative medicine is very popular, which has its good and its bad elements to it for
Yeah.
sure. So, there is this quite like this tendency to avoid certain ways of treating illness. For example, with endometriosis, they're way less inclined to do multiple surgeries on a person,
Mm-hmm.
whereas in the UK, once you get past the waiting list, there isn't really any sort of judgment about whether or not they should do it, kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways that holds you back, and the language actually is quite different. Like, there's still, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but basically they still use a version of handicap as the Dutch word for disabled,
Wow.
um, which obviously, it, coming from the UK, I was really shocked at, um, which is definitely different. But then, for example, I would say, 80% of the older people in Amsterdam are using mobility scooters. Like, they're all
Mm-hmm.
over the city. They ride in the bike lanes. They're sort of just like a normal part of what everyone, they're just used as a mode of transport here. So there is differences like that. I find the underground all has lifts, like our metro system is much more accessible. So I find it easier in some ways to be unwell here, particularly compared to London.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but culturally speaking, I think they are a bit further behind when it comes to invisible illness, disabled children, like those neurodivergence as well, like those kinds of things, I would say.
That honestly, like, I love having these conversations because being able to look at disability and be like, do you know what, it's treated differently in this place because of this thing, and like there's a language barrier, and how we accept it is different, and actually we look after our elderly better, which means that we can see there are good parts about disability, but there are also not so great parts about it. And for you, and as you said, like, it's almost, easier is not the right word, but it's a more pleasant experience to travel around Amsterdam as like an ambulatory wheelchair user than it is London, because we all know that London is horrendous to travel around if you are a person who uses a wheelchair, because not all the lifts work in the tube, and then not all the tube has like step-free access, and then that's the whole issue in and of itself. And do you think that the move that you made to Amsterdam, I know you said that you wouldn't have made it if you were like a single disabled woman in their early 20s, but do you think that the move has benefited you because you maybe do have that a little bit more, and freedom isn't the right word because it's not freedom that we're talking about, but it's that access to being able to move freely through a place without having to worry too much about its accessibility compared to where you've been? Because obviously nowhere is fully accessible, and that's a fact of life, and it's a really crappy fact. But compared to London and its accessibility, do you think it's easier than it is? Do you think Amsterdam is easier than it is in London?
I think the one other thing I want to say about culture, which I think is quite important for people who live with chronic pain, is I find, at least in my experience, there's a much more morally neutral view to prescription painkillers. In the UK, I
Uh,
really struggled to ever get any medication. I was called a drug pusher or like a drug seeker multiple times in A&E for asking for anything above paracetamol for,
wow.
a cyst.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially, I was living in Brighton at the time, and that was, does have a lot of people dealing with substance abuse issues. So there, but there's such a huge moral panic, and it's now, I find it wild when I go back to the UK and I'm in Sainsbury's, and you're only allowed to now buy one packet of paracetamol at a time
Yeah.
that has like 2 days worth of it in it, which would not touch the signs on any part of my pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed such a huge difference now with my pain doctor here. She has such a morally neutral approach to drugs and to prescription pain relief that it feels, she basically was like, my cabinet's open, like, we can try anything, but we want to try something that's, long term sustainable, that's not going to help you just for a few weeks. And obviously she is a good doctor, but just, it was such a breath of fresh air to have someone want to collaborate with pain relief
Yeah.
for you, versus in the UK I was always just made to feel like a bad person for not being able to cope with the pain I was in.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said about a
um
morally neutral stance, because I think that that's so important. But please, Feel free to answer the rest of my question because I fully just cut you up then.
Oh no, that's fine. What was your other part? Is it easier?
Yeah,
No,
is it
do
is
I
it
feel more
easier? Do you
free?
feel like free is maybe not the right word, and I don't think it is, but do you feel like there is a bit more control maybe about where you can and can't go in Amsterdam compared to London or like the UK in
I
general?
think so, like geographically, yeah, so geographically it's a much smaller city.
Mm-hmm.
So I can use the trams, but even then I don't often need them. Like my partner can push me to 3 different parks we live within 10-minute walk of. We have, multiple coffee shops, multiple cafes. Like it's just a much more neighborhood sort of setting
Mm-hmm.
that is hard to compare just because of the size of the city.
Yeah.
And I think I also it was what I think was actually most transformative to me was I moved here as a wheelchair user, whereas in the UK I became a wheelchair user. So my historic friendships had to sort of get used to me and understand. And I felt like when I moved here, and I'm so blessed to have met like some of the best friends in the world here, like other Brits, German friends, Dutch friends, like I just felt so accepted because I came as my full self. I came as like,
Yeah.
this is me. I've got energy limitations. I live in pain. Like I just felt so free to be the whole disabled me instead of feeling, I think I had a lot of internalized ableism about feeling like a burden on people, feeling like flaky, feeling like, oh, sorry, we have to go somewhere with step-free access. Like all of that was still weighed heavy on me, and it doesn't weigh heavy on me living here.
I love that. Like saying what you said about like showing up as your full disabled self really hit a chord with me because I think it can be so difficult to embrace that part of yourself, especially when you acquire a disability. Because, like, for me, I don't know any different. Like, disability has been my whole life and it will be my whole life. Like, my arm is never going to grow back, so there's no point in thinking that it will. But what you said about being able to turn up as your full disabled self was actually really beautiful because it is now who you are. And that's not to say that your disability is your personality or that, like, it's like that's solely what you do and who you are, but being able to show up authentically as your disabled self and be like, do you know what, here I am and this is what it is. And like you said, nobody's there to be like, oh, but like last week you were walking and you were fine. And not having that and just feeling like you can be like, do you know what, laying all your cards on the table. This is my disability. This is how it works. There are multiple different things here, but it's who I am. Accept it or leave it is a really beautiful place to be. And like, I'm genuinely like so happy for you that you have that experience there because I think it's something that as disabled people we all strive for, but we don't always necessarily get. So when somebody does get it, I'm like, I feel the best for you because it's an amazing feeling to turn up as your full self and to have people accept you for exactly who you are. And that's like, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's that thing of like because nobody with acquired disability, there's such a distinct before and now. There's the people who knew you before you got sick, the ways you
Mm-hmm.
were, the things you did, and then there's the people who know you after. And I think with acquired illness, there's also this idea sometimes that like you've changed or your personality's changed. And I have this ongoing question in the moment of like when I was younger, I thought I was an extrovert, and now I think I'm quite introverted, but I don't know if it was my illness that made me introverted or if
Mm-hmm.
it was that I was always that way. And as a young person, I was masking a lot and I wanted to fit in. But now I think that that unapologetic nature has also transferred into like I'm just not a person who likes parties. I don't think I ever like parties. And now sort
Yeah.
of that's something I was able to walk into this new group of friends and people with just being like, that's not something Hannah does. And I don't have to explain it or
Yeah.
question it, or it almost gives you this chance to not reinvent, but just sort of, it is just be your authentic self, as cheesy as it sounds. And I think that has helped me also with my historic friendships and relationships because I've become more confident and more able to articulate my needs and wants. I've been able to bring that back to friends. For example, when my friends from the UK visit, they know that it's, a 10:30 bedtime on a Saturday night. Like we're not going out and doing stuff. Like I've been sober almost a year now. Like they know, and I'm able to say those things and feel confident with them, instead of being like, oh God, when they visit they'll probably want to do this, or they'll probably want to party, and I'll have to push myself and then put myself in a big crash.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's not what I'm prepared to do anymore.
Yeah. And that is so important, to be able to be like, here are my boundaries, this is what they are, like it or lump it, it is what it is. And don't get me wrong, it is definitely a journey to get to there, regardless of whether you acquire a disability or you are disabled from birth. Like, that is still a journey, but being able to get to that point and being like, this is my boundary, it's in place. Like you said, it's a 10:30 bedtime on a Saturday night. If you don't like it, don't worry about it. See you later. And like, there's power in that, because by you being your authentic self, you're almost allowing somebody else to be their authentic self. And that's when we spark change. And that's really, really important. And like I said, really beautiful.
Yeah, I think about sparking change is so funny actually, because I've had some friends to visit this past winter, and they've all, multiple of them have left to being like, oh, you live such a wholesome and quiet life, and it's actually inspired me to slow down, or it's made me think that
Yeah.
I don't need to go to 3 birthday parties and a brunch in one weekend. Like, because my partner and I both together, we live a much slower pace of life here because of my pain, because of my energy limitations. We live, and our friends here actually are quite a lot bit older than us, who are
Mm-hmm.
also, in settled relationships, who are also, last weekend they came over and helped us do the gardening on the balcony. Like, that's what we do on our weekends, which
Yeah.
is not what my friends in London are doing. But then when you do have people and you invite them into your life, and let you see the way that you live, and the real way that you live, instead of performing a way that
Mm-hmm.
you think others want you to be, you never know what kind of thoughts and conversations you spark after they leave. Because
Yeah.
people, I think, are really fucking exhausted, people are tired, people are burnt out, and they don't know how to say no to stuff. So almost this idea of, which is what my mum always taught me, lead by example. Like, people get an insight into, like, okay, I don't have to live this hyper busy, productivity driven, burnout culture life. I can take a step back and be like, I actually don't like drinking anymore, or I don't like X thing anymore. And so I do feel proud, I guess, going back to your question earlier about what do you feel proud of. I feel proud that I live a life that feels authentic to me, and I feel proud that I can instigate change in the people that I've known for a long time, who maybe are living in a way that they don't truly deeply feel like is them.
Oh, I think that in itself is a really like powerful sentiment. And I really enjoyed this conversation, because I think we've spoken a lot about grief and actually how life changes, and becoming your authentic self, which all sounds very woo woo, but actually it's really, really needed, particularly when we're talking about disability, because we have these conversations, and people don't realize that there is grief involved, and actually that can take a little bit of time. And can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so my earphones have just died. Perfect. Right
Oh.
right as I was in the middle of something really sentimental. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So I think what you said about, having these moments of being able to live your own authentic life, and realizing that for yourself is so, so important. And I really want to thank you for being so candid about speaking about grief and about how you have different diagnoses, because it's not always easy to talk about these things, and having that moment at 21, when life literally flips on a knife edge. And that's really important to have these conversations, and I really thank you for being so open and honest about them. I've only got a final question for you, Hannah, and that is, are you disabled and proud?
It's an
It's an
ongoing work in
ongoing work in
progress,
progress. Yeah.
but I'm trying
But
every
I'm trying
day.
every day. Oh, do you know what though? I think that is the perfect answer, because being an ongoing process is really important, because we don't always reach the final destination. Like, this idea that we reach this final destination is actually like the biggest effing lie we've ever been told. There is no final destination, because the goalposts always change. But I love that actually it's an ongoing process, but I try every day. Because what more can you want, and what more can you do? And thank you so much for coming on and being so open and candid. I really loved listening to you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great.